This is a re-upload. If you haven't seen it, enjoy. There's a lot to be said about our ability to sense danger before it happens. Sometimes it almost seems uncanny. It brings up a lot of questions like, where does this come from? Some people would claim that it was an evolutionary thing, where our senses would pick up small changes in our environment, be it sights, smells, sometimes imperceptible to the normal conscious mind, but your feelings still pick up on it. Some of them claim that it's paranormal, being able to foretell the future, or something they probably couldn't have known. There's a lot of things we don't understand. I found some cases where someone's gut instinct actually saved their lives, or the lives of other people. I used to pick up hitchhikers a lot in the 80s and early 90s. I was into Jesus, and I wanted to do some good deeds. One day I saw two women who looked rough hitchhiking on the side of I-295. This was near Jacksonville, Florida. Based on their appearance, I thought they were leaving an abusive situation or something. I pulled over to pick them up. As they walked up to my van, they exchanged some creepy looks. Sort of, "Are we gonna do this?" expression. Well, I got a bad vibe from it, and instead of sticking around, I drove off as they reached my door. I felt bad about it later, and I did beat myself up for it. What if they really needed help? A few days later, I come to realize that I made the right choice. I saw sketches of them on the news. It was Eileen Wuornos, the serial killer from the movie Monster, and her girlfriend. More than likely, the guy who picked them up after I drove off was probably murdered and dumped in the swamp. If I would have picked him up, I probably would have been her 8th victim. When I was 15, I hung out with some friends after school. I got a ride home that night. No one's been home all day, so there was no lights on inside or out. The friends that drove me up, they didn't stick around to see me make it inside. So I'm starting to make my way up the walkway, and I make it to my front door. Then I have a feeling that someone's waiting for me. I calmly step back. After taking a couple of steps, I said, "Nope," loud enough for the potential criminal to hear me. Then I briskly turned around, and I walked swiftly down the street. I cut through the neighbor's backyard and went to the next street over. I made my way to the nearest payphone. I dialed the police and told them that I think someone's in my house trying to rob it. I get back when the police officers arrive. He shines his flashlight around the door and sees footprints in the snow leading around the house. He follows those and he sees that they're around the entire house. There was in fact someone waiting for me to open the door. I kind of laugh at the thought of their surprise to have some teenage girl acknowledge them from a distance and tell them not today. Had a coworker who used to go to parties in high school. Several of the parties in her senior year was at some guy's farm. She went to one and then she bailed right out of there because she said it felt really weird. The guy who owned the farm was Robert Pickton. If you don't know who Robert Pickton is, he was active for over 20 years. He was apparently a multi-millionaire who would have women over for parties and sex. Usually those were prostitutes, homeless, or drug addicts. He would then kill them and dismember them, eventually feeding them to the pigs. He later admitted to 49 different murders on the farm. She's just glad that she's not one of them. So back when I was 9 years old, my dad used to go treasure hunting for some World War II relics. He was a collector. Now he had a bunch of friends that he would go out and do it with. He had quite a few connections. Now he was introduced to a guy. Let's call him Ivan. They quickly became friends. But my mother, for some reason, she never liked him. She couldn't put her finger on why. She always had a bad feeling around Ivan. She tried telling my dad, but he just shrugged it off. One day my dad decided to go on an expedition. My mother begged him not to go because she felt a sense of dread over him going. Again, he shrugged it off. A day later, my father is missing. The police were called and an investigation was started. My mom asked around in his friends group and found out that he was last seen with Ivan and that they went somewhere near the dam. A search party was organized, and one of them was led by Ivan himself, because he was near the dam with him a couple of days ago, before he disappeared. My mom, she also had a very bad feeling about that and was very skeptical. So she put together a second search party with some previous older friends and family. Hours later, a body was discovered by the second search party. He was hastily buried under a thin layer of leaves and wet dirt. He had to have been there for days because the body was in very bad shape, and the rain didn't help. His face was almost unrecognizable. That night, my mother had the feeling to change the locks because his body was looted and the keys were with them. It was a good thing she did, because the next night, she heard keys clanging and scratching against the lock. She called the police, but by the time they got there, he was gone. Here's what really happened. Ivan and my dad went alone to look for some World War II relics. And when the opportunity came, Ivan shot my dad with an old double-barreled in the back. He took his belongings, and he planned to rob us and probably kill us during the night, if not for my mother changing the locks. He also purposefully led the investigation as far as possible away from the real location of the body. Good thing he's running behind bars now. I used to clean vacant houses for a living. One day I was working at a house near the end of a dead-end street. There was maybe 6 or 7 houses on one side before the intersection with a stoplight. So it was a pretty heavy traffic area. I was cleaning out the property just fine when I got this gut-wrenching feeling that went off the charts. I was inside the house, but I pretty much dropped everything, and I got in my car and I started driving out of there. On the corner, I saw this weird-looking guy. I had a really nasty feeling about him. When I got home, it was all over the news. That guy was later known for being a cop killer. He made the start of his career right there on that street corner. And this occurred only 15 minutes after I left. And I told my boss that I wasn't ever going back to that property. He understood. My mom and dad were at some sort of festival when my dad felt some sort of change in the air, like something bad was going to happen. He and my mom got out of there quickly, but wouldn't you know it, some drunk dude with a gun started firing into the crowd. One night around 4 a.m., I got the oddest feeling that I needed to make sure that the downstairs windows and doors were locked. So I double-checked. 2 of the windows were unlocked, and only an hour later, I heard something slam against the front door. And when that didn't work, I hear them trying to push open the window. I never found out what it was, but thank goodness I had that overwhelming feeling. I live in a small town where we know all of our neighbors and pretty much everyone in town. You know instantly if someone is an outsider. I lived in a small cul-de-sac with 8 houses. It was 2 doors away from 2 girls that I went to school with. Our house was beautiful. My dad built it himself with some friends. It was 2 stories. My sister and I had our own rooms. The living room was huge. It had a huge fireplace, which kept it warm during the winter. So my sister and I would regularly play in there. The living room was rectangular, with the stove along one long wall, with the couch at an angle at the same wall. The opposite wall was a huge opening that led into the hall and entryway. My sister and I had a toy box right behind the angled couch. Mom always said we could make whatever toy mess we wanted that was within that triangled area between the couch and the wall, and she would never ask us to clean it up. You couldn't easily see it from the living room. You'd have to look over the back of the couch. The fireplace was unique. When my dad built the house, he decided to plan for power outages. He ran a cold water pipe into the back of the stove, where it made a U, went back out of the fireplace and upstairs to a large metal tank. During the power outage, we could easily get hot water by opening up the 2 valves on the back of the stove. Think about that for a moment. The more technically minded people might know what's about to happen. One fall day it started to get cold. My sister and I headed down to the living room, and we played while our mom started the fire. When I heard the fire starting to roar, we went out to sit with our mom, in front of the fireplace to get cozy and warm. After a few minutes, I looked up and my mom got a faraway look in her eyes. I asked her, "What's the matter?" And she replied, "We need to clean up your toy area." Well, we were kids. We were told we didn't have to clean up that area ever. We were warm. We were by the fire. Obviously, we started to whine and argue. After about 15 seconds of this, Mom spoke up again. "We need to clean the toy area now." She grabbed my sister by her pajama tops and me by the neck, and she yarded us over the couch into the toy area with such a force that my sister and I were momentarily stunned. That's when it happened. Just as my mom crouched down behind the couch with us. When my dad turned off the stove at the end of the year, he closed the valves on either side of the U. That way it would prevent leaks. There was still water trapped in the U, and it had reached incredibly high temperature and pressure, and there was nowhere to go. We heard a tremendous boom. The pipe had exploded, sending fiery logs, sparks, and ashes everywhere. The heavy iron door was 15 feet across the living room and was embedded in the sheetrock. We all stood up. It looked like a war zone. The carpet was on fire and melting. Smoke filled the room. Mom grabbed us again, my sister by her pajama top, me by my arm, and we ran barefoot across the molten plastic carpet. She wrenched open the front door and tossed us out into the cold. She yelled to my sister, "You stay here, don't move." Then she turned to me and shouted, "Run to the neighbors and call the fire department." Then she darted back inside to start to fill up buckets from the bathtub to put out the fire. I started running down the short driveway, across the cul-de-sac, across the island in the middle, up to our neighbors. I pounded on the door. I was still in my underwear. After a few seconds, the neighbor's dad opened the door and he looked astonished. I shouted, "Call the fire department!" This was back in the day before the 911 service, and I surprised myself. I had memorized the number on a little sticker near our phone. The neighbor grabbed me and pulled me inside. That way he could warm me up. He shouted to his wife, "Call the fire department!" And he ran out to help my mom. Well, the fire department finally got to work. Even the sheriff's deputies showed up. Someone called my dad too, and he raced home. It seemed like an eternity. We got to tour the charred living room. The logs that blasted out of the stove was embedded in the sheetrock, and it had splintered 2x4s in the wall. One of them embedded itself into the electric hot water heater that was in the closet across the hall. If we hadn't moved just a few seconds before, I'm sure we would have been dead. Years later, I asked my mom, "How did you know?" She would always get this distant look in her eyes and reply, "I don't know. I just heard this small voice." I'm not sure if this was premonition or if God was just looking out for me. But I was living in West Hollywood, and I was on my way home late at night. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the streets were almost completely vacant. I came to a stop at a stoplight. I was going to have to make a left-hand turn, and the radio wasn't on, and I was completely sober. I've been babysitting my niece. I looked over to my left, and in the far lane, there was this guy looking over at me. You know how it's late at night, long red lights, so you look around while you're waiting. Suddenly I heard a voice in my head say,
"If you go when the light turns green, you will die."
Talk about freaking out. It terrified me. I started shaking, and I'm telling you, you couldn't have pried my foot off the brake. Well, the light turned green, and I just sat there. The guy in the other car was still looking at me, so I don't know if he also heard the voice, or was looking at me, so he didn't notice the light. After about 5 seconds, a car blew through the intersection, running the red light with 3 police cars following behind him at very high speeds. If I had gone into that intersection, I would have been killed. And if the guy in the other lane had gone, he probably would have died also. I often get thoughts, ideas, or premonitions, and I've learned it's important to listen to them. A few short years ago, a female friend of mine, who's also a nurse, was offered a free $4,000 helicopter ski vacation. A wealthy male friend of hers had bought it, but his wife had a dream that he would die in an avalanche. His wife was so traumatized by the dream, she made him give away the vacation. So he gave it to her because she was an avid skier. So she went, and there was an avalanche. It buried 3 people. She was partially buried, but she dug herself out, and she was able to reach the others and dig them out as well. One man was so badly buried that when she freed him, he had stopped breathing. She had to perform CPR to bring him back to life. There was no fatalities because she is an emergency room nurse who knows life-saving techniques. Perhaps she was only partially buried because she's a lighter female, or made different choices as the avalanche struck. It's not my story, but one of the most bizarre cases of premonition I've personally ever known involving life and death, where a person changed their plans ahead of time. I know I would have had a hard time giving up an expensive vacation because my wife had a bad dream. When I was 25 and newly married, my husband asked me if I wanted to go for a motorcycle ride. I said, sure, let's go. I got my helmet and we were walking out the door. And then it hit me hard. I had a feeling not to go on the ride. I told him how I felt and I begged him not to go. He went, and when he got back, he was so quiet. He came into the kitchen where I was fixing dinner and said, I'm sure glad you didn't go with me. If you had been on the bike with me, we would have been in a terrible accident. That was all he said about it. From then on, if I had a bad feeling about something, he listened, and so did I. Thank you guys for joining me for this edition of The Creeper. Have you guys had any gut instincts that's saved you from something that potentially have been dangerous or even embarrassing? Tell me about them in the comments. I'd love to read them. I'm going to give a special thanks to my patrons or members. If you want to become a patron or a member, you can follow the links down below. If you want to be a member of YouTube, you can join the membership button. You'll get instant access to whenever I download videos, and they'll be ad-free. I'm not sure exactly how much it is, but, I'd love to have you. And with Patreon, you can get downloadable MP3s that you can listen to anytime you want. And as soon as I'm done recording, I upload it first before I get the videos done. Thank you again for joining me. Stay safe out there. And until next time, this is Dallas, signing off.